Super excited to have you both, Patrina and Rich, on today to talk about the exciting topic of AI in field medical, which I know AI has been a hot buzzword, I feel like, of the last year and a half. So I think it'll be interesting to dig in and kind of chat through what we've been seeing over the last year to year and a half with you guys. But I think before we dig in further into that topic, I would love to maybe for both of you to do a brief round of intros and then we can dig in. Does that sound good?
All right. Well, thank you, Vera, for having us. And I have been in medical affairs for a long time, about, let's say, 25 years or so. I left Amgen and retired last year and started MSL Growth with Patrina and do some consulting as well. So I've been a field medical expert for a long time, used to manage teams. I even started as an MSL. So I've really seen this grow over time. Really happy to be here. Turn it over to Patrina.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vera. We're very excited to talk about what field medical teams can be doing to leverage AI more. And we're going to try to take a different approach, just so you guys know. Not going to be like all these other webinars we've been seeing recently, but those have been helpful, definitely. So I'm Patrina Pellet. I started in medical affairs about 6 years working on insights and AI. So I'm really excited to share with you guys what I know now or then have seen then to what's happening now. And as Rich mentioned, we help MSLs improve their insights gathering and help increase their impact through different online training options. So definitely reach out to us if you guys are interested in that.
Absolutely. Well, I'm super excited to, both of you have such interesting backgrounds. Rich, you have a background of over 2 decades. So you've really seen the medical affairs function and the field medical affairs function evolve, not only from kind of process and team perspective, but also through all of the different technological shifts. And then Patrina with your work on the AI side of things with, as we called it in our prep, dinosaur AI.
It was definitely dinosaur AI. Yeah, I'll tell you guys all about it shortly.
Well, yes, super excited to hear your perspective. I feel like, especially on how AI, has evolved over just the last 5 years, which in the grand scheme of things is not really that long, right? Well, with that, I wanted to ask both of you actually, what do you feel like in the last couple of years has shifted when it comes to field medical and insights gathering? I feel like over the last year or two, insights has been this hot topic when it comes to medical affairs as well as field medical. Why do you think that is the case today?
So I think, especially 5 years ago, when we were thinking about applying AI to insights, it was really on the analysis side of things. And so with the NLP models that people were using, it was really common to help with analysis steps by applying NLP and then tagging your insights. And then this made the data visualization easier. So then field medical leads or medical directors could start to see trends like spikes or declines in the data, and then they could hone in and dig a little bit more deeply on what was going on with those spikes. And now with these newer versions of AI, Gen AI, it's completely changed the game in terms of insights analysis because you can take more of a conversational approach. So before, where we were asking the AI to just tag our stuff and act like a things labeler, we're now able to interact with the AI a little bit more and do things like ask it to provide us with summarizations. But I think a really interesting place or direction that we're going with the new Gen AI is that it's more accessible or going to change the way that MSLs and people in the field are working. So before it was really targeting the analysis side of things, not so much the entry. Okay, now I'll be quiet and I'll let Rich go.
Oh, no, just to build on what you're saying, I think the big shift has also been a shift towards ensuring that the insights are tied to a strategy that the company needs. So 5 years ago, it was, to Patrina's point, more about, we're tagging this to ensure that we can parse through and identify the number of discussions on safety or efficacy or whatnot. Now the shift is a realization that the quality of the insights really matters. And there needs to be a demonstration that you tie it to the medical strategy that really makes a difference. It's no longer just a boil the ocean approach on what people are saying, but rather, what are they saying relevant to the medical strategy that we need?
That's a good point. We were discussing that earlier in the prep call where Vera had that really good example on a common insight that we'll see people write would be something like, oh, the HCP said they like our product. And so this is something that Rich and I see happening all the time and we help in our training. But this type of insights entry is not going to help with the AI. And Vera, I feel like I'm stealing your thunder. This was her idea, you guys.
Totally fine. Well, we're kind of, this is, I think, a really great segue into, the topic of, okay, how do we really enable field medical teams to leverage to its fullest potential? And part of that, beyond understanding and being AI literate, for example, understanding how Gen AI works, et cetera, is also what is the process and what is the quality of data that you're gathering? Because we all know garbage data in, garbage insights ultimately out. So I think, Patrina, you brought up a really great example, and I'm curious, to hear from both of you around the topic of establishing a really good insights process and what actually defines a quality insight. So I'm curious, what is a quality insight to you both?
I can start, but a quality insight for me is something that's actionable, something that aligns to the medical affairs strategy, something that is accurate and allows a return, if you will, in a discussion with the MSL who brought it for a longer term enduring relationship, if you will, on that discussion point. So it's not a one and done. It's part of a longer term effort to ensure that you can educate or improve patient care. You can place in that structure any number of approaches, but insights that move the needle are really critical, and that means they need to be actionable, and you need to close the loop on what happened because of that information back with the MSL who brought it.
So I'm curious, Rich, if as a follow-up question to that, do you have maybe an example or two of, let's say, like a bad insight, and then what a really high quality version of that insight might look like? And then I think second to that would be, how do teams go from, maybe a standard baseline of normal quality insights to what is the process to enable those high quality insights?
Why don't I try to go on the two examples, and then Patrina can talk and tee up on what we really need in this space to improve MSL insights. A bad example is similar to the one that you already raised, and it could be Dr. Smith didn't like the Table 1 results in the New England Journal publication. Well, that sounds pretty horrible, right? I mean, nobody would want to receive that as an insight from a field medical staff member. On the other hand, if the feedback or the insight entered was, Dr. Smith found the disease state educational deck assesses the current standard of care and points out the opportunity to improve how patients are treated based on this new mechanism, and that led to a discussion in which he expressed interest in participating in our clinical study. Now, I'm probably piling on too much there to show a good example, or one that's at least interesting. But the realization that the MSL has in what the implication is and why that physician said what they said is critically important to include in an insight. And that will help LLMs or any number of Gen AI approaches in helping determine what was impactful or not, and what is a good, meaningful insight. So anyway, to get us started on your first questions, and I'll turn it over to Patrina.
Yeah, I think Rich did a really good job explaining that. The secret sauce for all the MSLs on the phone or on the line and all the managers and training people, as you guys already know, it's including the why. It's really hard to act on a piece of information if you don't know the why. Or sometimes you'll hear people describe this as the motivations or the HCPs or KOLs perceptions. When you have that, that's what takes it one level down. And to Rich's point, that's what is going to allow LLMs to extract more meaning out of it. Sorry, I'm going to get that. And in terms of your question on how do we enable teams to do this, I think it comes back to a couple things. One that Rich mentioned around providing feedback to the MSLs. There's a huge gap in our industry right now where MSLs gather insights and they feel like it goes into a black hole. So we really need our medical leadership to close that gap and communicate back to the MSLs what is good or not, what actions have been taken. I would say another area that we're seeing really help people consistently get good insights is with a coaching type training model. So we're kind of moving a little bit away from these all day big workshops to more ongoing small bite-sized training to really help drill the point home.
I think the only thing I would add is the ability to make sure that training is consistent, that training on entry, training on understanding the insight cycle about how it works at the company that you are at as an MSL, and that repetition of training and the importance of consistency to guide how stuff is entered and how it's analyzed is really critical. Without those kinds of approaches, you get what we have now and see at some smaller companies where the people may still be using Excel spreadsheets, and they're just trying to throw something on a wall to see what sticks, to identify what an insight might be. And so, without the stuff we just covered, I think the quality suffers.
I think one of our best tips that Rich and I like to provide for MSLs when they're writing insights is to remember that the people analyzing the insights were not in the room with you. They weren't in that meeting. So
Yeah.
they need to have enough context in the why to be able to extract meaning out of it. And that's going to be true for the AI as well. So I think all of these trainings and basics around what is a good insight is going to be just as important as more teams start implementing AI to mine their insights or do analysis with it.
So it's almost like what I'm hearing in summary is a quality insight is rich enough and has that why and the context that is tied ultimately to your medical strategy or the unmet medical need, right? Which is probably what your medical strategy is targeting in the first place. And then in order to establish a good kind of hygiene or routine around continuously producing high quality insights, it's really about that consistency and process and having the feedback loop from leadership and management on kind of, it sounds like two elements. One element of, did we act on the insight, which I think also ties to motivation of, I want to go and get more insights because I saw my insight made an impact, right? And in moving this drug or impact on patients, et cetera. And then there's the consistency in leadership providing feedback to potential MSLs via coaching to ensure that they almost habitually start producing quality insights or better insights.
Good summary. Perfect.
It is perfect. And as you're reframing that, the thing that I think about the most is the importance of strategy and medical strategy in particular, because it needs to frame up what MSLs are looking for, what they will deliver, and importantly, what they're not looking for, right? That strategy tells you up front what you do and what you don't do. And that's an important distinction from the boil the ocean approach that we mentioned earlier, because some MSLs, if you're fearful of hitting your number of insights delivered in a given month, may begin to become tempted to enter everything, including stuff that's really not even on strategy or not even relevant. And so that's just an important thing to help provide focus that I think is, sometimes we see that lacking, that lack of focus.
Yeah, that's such a good point, because I feel like that also ties really well into garbage data in, garbage insights out, in the sense that if the data is diluted, so you have non-focused, boil the ocean type of insights, what the AI quote is going to get out of that will probably be somewhat similar. So like not as focused, and also a little bit of boiling the ocean. Well, before we digging into how Gen AI and kind of this new wave, what difference this can make in terms of insights for MSLs and field medical teams in general, I'm curious to hear how historically the dinosaur AI, as we will call it, was previously applied to field insights, to just set the stage there, because then we can then talk about how this new AI, why it's different, and what are kind of the new applications of it. So I'm curious, Patrina, I know you've worked on that side. How was AI historically applied in field medical?
So as I mentioned before, the NLP models that a lot of medical affairs teams were using is a tagging mechanism. So think of it as like a thing labeler. So what would happen before, a field medical team would collect a huge pile of insights, and then a medical director and insights lead would have to read an Excel spreadsheet and start tagging them. So is it relevant to this topic or this scientific communication pillar topic, this listening priority? And that's incredibly manual. And so what was really great about these early generations or early applications of AI to insights is that it took away that administrative burden. And then medical directors and stuff could start spending their thinking time actually thinking about what the data means and what kind of actions could be derived from it instead of spending all that time collating. I mean, if you're in a big TA like cardiovascular or diabetes or COVID, you're going to be getting a lot of data to go through. So I think, especially in the areas where there's large volumes of data, I don't even know if they're first generation, early generations of NLP were super useful. Rich, do you want to add anything to that? And we could talk a little bit about challenges that we've seen with that, although I'm not sure how applicable they are now.
I would only add, I've seen other dinosaur approaches that I've used even in the past to harvest information from call transcripts at a call center and use that as an early warning system to determine what may be brewing in terms of concern from a patient perspective. And that's kind of how things started, this dinosaur era of trying to figure out how do you leverage NLP to find something actionable. And now here we are, just 5 years later or so, and we're in a totally different environment where, I think our expectations collectively in the industry are way up high, and the education and familiarity are probably way down low.
Yeah, absolutely. And I am curious actually, because I think this will help set the scene for the new dinosaur AI. It probably honestly will be the dinosaur.
Yeah, in a year.
How
Yeah.
quickly things are moving. But what kind of challenges did you both see perhaps with kind of this more traditional NLP type of approach? What gaps existed even with that technology?
The things that I saw in particular were in how MSLs were entering insights and which actual words they were using. So if an MSL used a particular abbreviation or maybe not the word that the AI was looking for, it wouldn't tag it. And you guys know, in these oncology space in particular, with all these like triple combos and all these varieties, I saw some issues where the AI wasn't properly tagging all the different ways that you could refer to these different combos. And then it also made the distrust spiral more, right? Because people saw, oh, this wasn't tagging this particular thing. Can I trust the AI? So there was a little bit around what you were calling things. So I was back in the day doing a lot of training on being very consistent in how you enter or label things so that it wouldn't get missed. Rich, what would you add?
Siloing of systems and data sets, which are less frequent now that people have kind of pivoted to a data lake model or whatever the nomenclature might be. And I think that's been a helpful change, but one that also shows that we're still struggling, I think, to ensure connectedness, if that's the right word, in disparate data sources. And so I think that the potential for AI to navigate those kinds of disparate data sources and do something meaningful with it is extraordinary, or at least I'm hopeful.
Yeah, I would say one other area to add. 5 years ago, what people really wanted was summaries. I mean, well, okay, let me be honest here. What people really wanted was the AI to pull out a magical insight that would like change their strategy and tell them what to do. And I think people still kind of want that today. But back then, the summarization was not very good either. And I think that, to me, is one of the biggest changes that we're seeing in the implementation of AI for field insight. So now you can put your disparate data sources together and you can ask it to summarize for you and get some pretty good summaries out.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of super kind of interesting topics that we could splinter off into.
How long do we have? Do we have like 6 more hours here? Or
we'll make a whole workshop,
yeah.
which is basically what this could be. But I think this kind of sets a foot into one, I think maybe perhaps defining like what is Gen AI, like the foundation and the basics of it. Why is it different than other waves of AI? Because that difference is important to know in order to know what are the new applications and why does it matter for field insights. And then I think another point that remind me if I don't get to this point is really this concept of I feel like almost, it's trust, to your point with like the AI labeling, but I oftentimes wonder if we place like undue burden on AI to be 100% perfect when humans are not. So should our standard when it comes to trust really be, well, is this AI on average equal to, if not more accurate than if a human did it? And then they're like, obviously it's going to make quote mistakes like a human would. But that's like a whole interesting separate topic. So with that, maybe what I'll do is kind of lay the foundation for what is Gen AI, how to think about ChatGPT, why is it different than other forms of AI. So maybe we'll start back with a little bit of the, I would say, the pre-dinosaur AI era, if that even exists, which is the way that I kind of think about tech innovation and life sciences maybe could be split up into 3 waves. The first wave was really digitization, right? So this was even, with the FDA, for example, the electronic submissions, I think happened maybe 8, 9 years ago. So that was going from like, your pink folders or like your pen and paper submissions to a digital approach. That wasn't like 8, 9 years ago is not that long in the grand scheme of things. In tech, I feel like that's like 100 years, each year, it's like dog years
Yeah, at
in a
least.
way in tech. Yeah. So that was like wave one, super simple, right? Then wave two, we went into like your traditional kind of machine learning, deep learning, which all of that exists today. And that's kind of like the NLP techniques that you mentioned with the tagging. And a lot of those models in wave two, I would think of them as kind of, they're focused on learning discrete units, right? So you would label, they would try to identify those keywords in the insight and maybe label off of that. Another way to think about it is, let's say I'm trying to build a house and I'm laying the, brick by brick by brick. And if I'm an AI model trying to learn how to build a house, I would look at that first brick and then the next brick and then the brick after, and then maybe I can predict the next brick, right? So it's very kind of singular, discrete, focus wave of AI. And what's interesting with generative AI and why it's really different is that generative AI is able to pick up on patterns, right? And this is kind of, Katrina, what you mentioned, where, for example, in perhaps the traditional NLP way, the AI model would sometimes miss the specificities of certain oncology terms because there could be like 10 different ways of saying them. Whereas Gen AI, because it's based on a technology called large language models, it's able to see those patterns in text and pick them up a bit easier. So if we take it to like the brick analogy and building the house, let's say I'm building the house and I'm building it with different color bricks. One's blue, one's green. Maybe I decide to make a circle with the bricks. So in a way, and this is simplifying it, but large language models can look at that pattern, right? And understand, and I put that in quotes because large language models, they don't reason, so they don't like actually understand, but they're able to pick up that pattern. Whereas traditional AI, in wave two, it wasn't able to do that.
So, can you talk a little bit more about kind of AI hallucinations and how that ties into the large language models, just for the people, field medical folks that maybe don't have a background in AI, and just to get a better understanding off of that great baseline that you started with?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in order to really understand things like why models hallucinate, or why sometimes if you ask a question of ChatGPT or your internal GPT, you might not be getting a quote comprehensive answer as you would like, is to really understand what are large language models and how do they work. Because a lot of this is just a function of how they're set up, which is at the end of the day, and this is a misconception I kind of see as well, is that large language models are not knowledge models. They're not fact learning models. They're not reasoning models. Large language models are simply that. They are language models. And what they do is when they're trained on a bunch of different texts, right, in literature, they effectively correlate statistically what words are effectively near each other. Another technical way to talk about is tokens, but for simplicity, you can think of it as words. So when they're trained, they try to statistically correlate what words are kind of near each other. So then let's say that model's done training and now you're asking it a question. That question consists of words. So that model effectively looks at your question, and then based off of its training, it statistically correlates what words are similar to the words in your question. And it just generates text off of that. It is literally a pattern matcher. It just happens to produce stuff that seems like it knows what it's doing or that it's reasoning, right? And perhaps to illustrate it with like a really specific example is, let's say you were to ask your ChatGPT, what causes diabetes? And the ideal accurate answer that's a lay answer would in this case be, diabetes is caused by a variety of genetic and environmental factors, including things like obesity. Very lay response, but generally truthful and accurate. But what if instead the ChatGPT responded with something like diabetes is caused by increased sugar intake and reducing sugar intake will cure diabetes? Obviously, that's very false, wouldn't pass MLR review, etc. So why does the large language model or ChatGPT do that? Well, that's likely because when that model was trained on a lot of text around diabetes, sugar intake was a phrase that was very close to diabetes. So they tended to, always be together. So when the model was done training and you ended up asking it that question of, what causes diabetes, those sugar intake and diabetes were the words that were most closely associated with your question. So therefore, it ultimately outputs that result. But what is not happening behind the scenes is it's not sitting there and thinking, like, let me go search medical literature, let me do some analysis and see what actually causes diabetes. It literally just correlates statistical words. So in a way, it's kind of dumb. Like like when you think about it, but it's kind of also wild that it can produce output that makes it sound like it is reasoning, which also kind of makes me question. I'm like, is that how we think?
Yeah. So, Vera, what do you think would be good advice for field medical people in terms of managing potential hallucinations? Do you think teams that have their own internal chats or GPTs and that have trained their own models are less likely to experience hallucinations? Or I'm going to stop asking questions and let you try to answer those first ones.
No, that's a really great question. So there's kind of two ways I would approach answering that. I think it's important to know, because of things like hallucinations or like a lack of comprehensiveness, so to speak, you have to understand when can you just apply ChatGPT versus when do you need to actually orchestrate a bunch of different tools to get to a certain outcome. We're all familiar with recipes. I'll use this analogy, right? So a recipe has ingredients, it has a list of steps to follow, and an ultimate outcome, which is a delicious meal. So ChatGPT, in essence, in this recipe analogy, is effectively an ingredient. So depending on what meal you're trying to make or what outcome you're trying to achieve, ChatGPT is just a tool. It is not a magic wand that can do all of those things. So ChatGPT by itself is really great for things like rephrasing a paragraph, or you could feed it a PDF, right? Whether you have an internal enterprise GPT, and it could give you a summary, but it may have hallucinations because remember, it's just statistically correlating words in that document. It is not reasoning through that PDF. Right. And it might not be comprehensive. So like, let's say this PDF had a bunch of adverse events and you uploaded it and you ask it a question about adverse events. It might give you a summary, but it might not be comprehensive. It might not pull all the adverse events right out of that PDF because again, it is not reasoning through or searching through the PDF. I mean, I would argue honestly for most high ROI scenarios, you can't just use ChatGPT to unlock it. But to address your question around hallucinations, like what can you do or like what are methods to reduce that? So there are several techniques that are done to manage hallucinations. You can, in theory, reduce them to zero, but it requires technical skill. So it's not going to be likely something that someone can just click a button and it goes and does it. The two most common ways to kind of manage hallucinations is you can, what you, Katrina, referred to, is fine tune a model. So oftentimes, the OpenAI, like Moderna, like GPT, whatever partnership, and they have like 700 GPTs. Likely what they did there is they took a GPT and they fine-tuned it on some data. So it could be, let us fine-tune it just on oncology publications or maybe oncology field insights. So what that does is it does not introduce logical reasoning. It just kind of tunes that model to be trained statistically correlate more accurate words near each other. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's in the diabetes example. If you instead kind of tune this GPT where diabetes, obesity, environmental, and genetic factors just happen to always be near each other, well, likely that fine-tuned version will produce a result that is, quote, more accurate. But fine-tuning does not logically reason away hallucinations.
Yeah. So I think what I'm hearing is that it's about understanding what AI can actually do and having reasonable expectations, which I think we kind of talked about in the beginning, where I saw this and felt it 5 years ago where people were like, why is this not giving me the magical answer?
Yeah.
It can't do that. It's a tool to help you do your job.
I
Yeah.
think it's also, we started to cover this point, but I think it's also worthwhile for field medical teams or medical affairs teams to understand generative AI approaches are not sentient thinking
Yes.
programs. They're,
I
to
love
our
that.
earlier
Yeah.
discussion, the output of LLMs that are based on statistical correlation or tokens, I guess, to some extent. So I think that's a huge benefit in educating medical affairs teams on what it isn't, because
Yeah.
there are a lot of people who are assuming that it is.
Yes, absolutely. And I think if anything, this whole fear around AI taking our jobs, let's just remember it's just a statistical model that is literally correlating, different words together. So maybe if anything, that allays a little bit of the concerns there, and that it is not AGI, despite the fear mongering and press and what certain people might message it as, for sure. Well, I think with that, actually, what this leads a great segue into is, okay, well, if you're a field medical team and you're interested in leveraging AI, and you have now an understanding of maybe what it isn't, and maybe some ideas of how you can leverage it, how do you go about setting up the right kind of process, so to speak, or the right data lakes, right, in order to even enable AI? So I feel like with that, and I'm curious, Rich and Patricia, because you brought up this topic of data lakes, but data quality is really important, right? And I think folks oftentimes might think that AI is this plug and play solution. It's one click, you just plug it in and it works, and we don't have to do anything. But I'm curious, what are you guys seeing on the ground?
Well, let me start, because I think sometimes people have a misconception about what can be done with all data, meaning like uncleaned data. And to our earlier discussion on this point, you can use LLMs to essentially clean up data before you do something else with it, which I think is commonly used now. Most medical affairs people don't think of it that way. They just think of flipping the switch and out is going to come the perfect thing I'm looking for once I, implement this new approach. And it says to me and underscores the need for people in medical affairs to be trained and have capabilities in this space, which I think generally is lacking. There aren't very many, especially if you look at team size and structure and so forth. Most of the money is going for field medical and management and so forth. But the operations component, I think, is underserved. And more than anything, this illustrates the point that medical affairs teams need to build these capabilities and build skills in the area.
Yeah, I think what another potential way to help with data quality and data management would be close collaboration with your IT team, right? I've been on several insights projects where we're implementing a tool and we brought in IT really late. I've seen that mistake being made a lot. So I think one piece of advice would be have your IT counterparts and colleagues front and center from the very beginning, helping make decisions around data quality. Because to Rich's point, a lot of field medical people don't have these skills and capabilities.
So I agree with your statements. I think it's interesting because I was recently reading this report on Gen AI adoption and enterprise, and there was an interesting statistic about how companies have lost hundreds of millions of dollars in their investment in AI because of various different things. But I think how this ties into here is, and kind of a concern that I also have, and just observing things that, as we're transitioning medical affairs to be more data driven, you need technical people at the table who can help inform that AI literacy or the data quality or the data literacy early enough. So that way, medical affairs teams that are interested and excited about AI don't unintentionally get themselves in a position where 12, 18 months from now, a project isn't successful, or they have to shut down, or all of their money was kind of burned because of something that could have been preventable had it been integrated into the planning process earlier. So I also just encourage just having an IT person at the table who understands the technology, because I see teams, heading Gen AI initiatives within medical affairs, they don't have technical backgrounds. That doesn't mean that a technical person isn't involved, but it's just a fear I have because there is so much excitement about this space.
I see it in hearing what you're both saying about this point. None of us in medical affairs would ever think of not involving regulatory compliance,
Good analogy.
law, in the generation of a new approach or some novel way of executing a field medical role. We wouldn't even think of not bringing those people in early and often, right? So
Yeah.
here we are in the AI space where some of this has already occurred in a little silo without pulling in the right IS or IT people or having that capability in-house, in the, from the companies that I'm, just a little bit familiar with. And I think that's a travesty, right? So we should collectively use this as a learning for medical affairs, that this is an opportunity to double down on early and often involvement of other stakeholders within a company from another function.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think this all kind of ties into this theme of just AI literacy, because oftentimes when I see teams that do get excited about Gen AI, they might not have necessarily technical person at the table, is because, and this is just my subjective kind of interpretation. Obviously, I don't know actually, right, why it's the case, is that I think there's kind of this perception that Gen AI and prompting is all you need to understand, which like you will get value out of prompting, right, and asking the right questions. But I think having the foundational knowledge of LLMs or statistical like models, right, correlating words is like quite important to know, because it can impact how you would approach technologically solving a certain problem within medical affairs. So I think there's this knowledge gap that's potentially causing the perhaps lack of knowing to even involve a technical person, because there's this perception that only prompting is enough, if that makes sense. Well, with that, the one thing I'll say on kind of the data lake front, and I don't know if you guys want to dig into it further, but what I have seen teams do that are investing technical resourcing into establishing kind of an insight data infrastructure is they are typically investing in a centralized database or a data lake where their different data sources will be plugged into. Of course, plugging in everything from med info, right, to your field notes, to publications, to clinical, maybe like earlier down the pipeline, like all of that data is a very intensive project, right? So typically what I see teams do who are interested in establishing this now is they'll start off with like a smaller focus. So they'll be like, let us just establish a data lake just for field. Okay, let's see how that goes. And then it's, can we plug in med info, right? And then can we plug these other data sources in? I like that approach because I think it de-risks it. And then two, also in investing in establishing your own data lake early on, you're setting up the foundation to be able to integrate any technology, including AI, more effectively moving forward, because Gen AI will evolve. And now, at least if you have the proper data lake, you're now able to take advantage of that technology much faster.
Okay, so I like that. I think what you're saying is that early in the beginning, establish a process to do kind of a layered or add-on approach to add different data sets to your data lake, with the idea that your data is going to need to be in a certain format later to be, can we say AI-able?
Yeah, so that AI can kind of understandable for AI.
Yeah, because I think Rich and I have seen a gap from some teams that are investing in huge AI projects for analyzing insights and combining disparate data sources, and they didn't realize how challenging the data management piece of it would be.
I was just going to add, it's possible. I like the finite approach that you mentioned, Vera, about starting small and adding on. There are some companies who started in other functions, for example, in clinical development or a larger R&D sense, in building their data lake, and then added in other capabilities like field medical over time. So, of course, that's been done with the realization that they've worked out all the kinks by the time you get around to field medical, which is a benefit, right? I've seen it done in a couple of different ways, but the end result is one and the same. An integrated set of accessible data exists for the company for use beyond just a sliver of a function.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, some companies too, depending on how they prioritize and look at data analytics across various functions, might even establish kind of a data lake across even commercial and medical affairs with the right governance layers, right? Obviously for compliance reasons and all of that. So, it ultimately kind of depends. What I see is, from an overarching company perspective, there's IT, right? They have a given set of priorities and resources, and maybe they are investing in a data lake that medical affairs can tap into, Or sometimes it's that, they're focused on a data lake for something else, but medical affairs still needs it. So there is a need still for medical affairs as the business unit to maybe build their micro data lake just for medical affairs to start off with. And then over time, maybe that could be merged into like the grand, company data lake if they want to, right? Or maybe they want to keep it within medical affairs because of specific, uses that medical affairs might have.
That's the pond versus lake approach.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So yes, I mean, I think building that right data infrastructure and also having a good process for gathering quality insights to feed into that data lake in a way establishes the foundation to be able to apply AI ultimately on top of that. I'm curious, and we might have kind of covered this, but I'm curious, to go off of that, what are ways that now that we've established kind of at a high level what generative AI is, when it can be used, when it should not be used, what do you all see as very interesting new applications for field medical or MSLs in ways that they can leverage ChatGPT?
Well, I think some use cases I've seen and that have been discussed at MAPS meetings and the DIA MASC meeting, for example, are opportunities and examples of processing huge amounts of data that can uncover a glimmer or an interesting new perspective on a problem that medical is grappling with, and to do it quickly in the moment. Whereas it used to take, Patrina mentioned this earlier, a huge amount of manual effort to review and collate and curate data to try to get to that point. And now you have the ability to do this in a much more rapid fashion and then be iterative on it to probe more fully and gain additional context and the why. So the speed of this that can be rapidly turned around even in scientific congresses is extraordinary. So you could really accelerate the process and dig deeper at will. I think we're just at the beginning of the use cases that are going to be uncovered.
Yeah, I think for another example of a use case I heard on a webinar the other day from a senior medical director, he was in a cross functional meeting. They had a question about an insights report or a trend, and he just asked the AI that question that they had on the call. So I think in terms of decision making and timeliness of turning around insights, it's going to have a huge impact. And so thinking about how do I interact with the AI, some things that will be important are being able to ask really good questions. So this is, you guys have probably seen it when you're playing around with Chat GPT, or if you haven't done that yet, you definitely should, but ask it a really basic question. You'll probably be disappointed with the results that it comes out with. So thinking about how do you ask your data really good questions is really going to impact how useful the results are that you get out. So I think to summarize, there's the kind of the real-time application of answering questions versus in the past, a lot of field medical teams know that maybe an MSL collects an insight in January, it gets analyzed in April, then maybe looked at in May, right? So maybe that's going to go away because now people have access to I'll use the word a conversational approach where they can just ask the data a question or ask the AI a question and get us a question back. I think in terms of MSLs, I haven't seen anybody doing this yet, but I think it's going to go this way. MSLs are going to have access to internal data and internal AI or GPTs. So thinking strategically about how you can use that to make yourself more productive will be interesting. So one thing you could think about would be asking it to summarize your prior interactions. It has to obviously have access to that data, but that could be a really good use case. You could also ask for help in terms of which questions should you ask this HCP or KOL. So trying to get people to think about data literacy and how they're using it in decision making for their day to day is the direction that I think that a lot of the AI is going to go beyond, obviously, real-time access to answering questions about insights.
And I think those approaches underscore the importance of the quality of entry, right? To our earlier discussion about garbage in, garbage out. And the same holds true here. If you're going to summarize previous interactions and there's not good quality content or information in there, then it's not going to be as useful. So
that's a really good point, Rich. We've all had meeting notes where we go to look back and we're like,
what was I trying to say there?
What happened in this meeting? Yeah.
That happens to me every day.
Yeah, exactly. So now think about in the context where you have AI that can summarize it for you. So that's going to be data quality is going to be even more important.
Yeah, it's a AI itself is not going to add extra richness to your insights. It's
That
only
would be
able
cool.
to. It would
Maybe
be cool.
maybe you could build that, Vera.
I mean, there's a concept of digital twins. So, I mean, could you create a digital twin of
Your
every
AI clone.
HCP?
Yeah.
Yeah, of every
Mhm.
HCP you've interacted with, and kind of, it's almost like you're chatting with the HCP with their persona. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
in theory, maybe you could. But, one thing I'll add to what you both are saying is maybe kind of bucket these different use cases into what can you only do with ChatGPT versus what do you need kind of other tech tools plugged in with LLM as an ingredient in a recipe in order to be able to accomplish. So you can just use ChatGPT, for example, if you do have historical notes with an HCP, it's fairly like short, maybe you copy paste it right into the chat and then you prompt ChatGPT to give you the next set of questions you should ask or maybe suggest what type of data you should present at your next HCP engagement. So like that's something that you probably could do with prompting. If you wanted that same scenario though, for example, if you wanted to be fully kind of automated where it kind of automatically pulls, your previous HCP engagements and, from Viva or wherever those notes are stored, analyzes that history, maybe also plugs in, for example, like literature or social, the Twitter profile of that HCP and what they might have recently talked about, like that more advanced level of orchestration requires more tech tooling to be involved. So that's not something that quote ChatGPT is able to do, by itself. And when people talk about, which is true, is that LLMs can really kind of quote analyze, volumes of data. So think like literature review, right? Or whatever other swaths of unstructured data you might have. Oftentimes those approaches, it's not just, quote ChatGPT. Oftentimes it's ChatGPT or LLM plus a lot of tech tools that actually do logical reasoning, right? Because LLMs are not logical reasoners. They don't search through all the literature. So you almost have to do it for the LLM and then feed in that context so then the LLM knows what to respond with. Also, sometimes ChatGPT as a solo tool might not actually be a productive efficiency gain. So here's like one example, and you guys let me know if this is helpful. But let's say you had this hypothesis that you're like, oh, Gen AI can help me automate my MLR review process. No one likes medical legal regulatory review, right? It's like really annoying to have to go through all the pieces of collateral. So if you were to take like a ChatGPT only approach to that, it might look like, hey, I'm reviewing this piece of collateral. There's a claim, right? There's a reference. Let's say this reference points to a PDF, right? And let's say the person didn't label where the evidence is. And it's a 100-page PDF. So you're like, oh man, bummer. Like, I don't want to go through all of this. So you're like, let me upload this. Let me download this PDF, upload it to ChatGPT, right? And maybe ask it like, hey, can you find the evidence in this PDF with this claim? Here's the claim. And then it pops something out. And you're like, okay, well, I don't know if it's hallucinating, so let me go and check it. So now you're like control F in the PDF to verify it. So now you're doing that back and forth like 100 times to get through, let's call it a 50-page presentation. So that I would actually argue, like, even though, yes, you're using ChatGPT to help, that's not actually creating efficiency gains. It probably would be easier if all of that was automated. As in, like, you had a tool that like parsed out all of the claims, took all the references, automatically like kind of pre-reviewed everything, right? And just displayed it all in one go. Like that would be a lot faster.
I thought you were going to say you just control F the PDF yourself.
Yes. And also
Yeah.
too. No, but it's your exact point. Like it could actually be faster for you to control F instead of use ChatGPT. So that kind of example just illustrates the point of, like, again, ChatGPT can be used as a solo tool, but oftentimes you need to orchestrate many tools for it to provide true efficiency depending on the use case, right?
Yeah, and I think to summarize, the key take home there is understanding your use case and what you're
Mhm.
trying to accomplish with it. Because I think we're all feeling this. Everybody wants to do something with AI or be fancy with AI versus thinking through what your problem is and what are possible
Mhm.
solutions, right? Because AI is probably one of the possible solutions, but it doesn't mean it's the best solution. As an example, on a webinar Rich and I did, somebody asked, how can we get started with AI with very little money? Right? That's the wrong question
Mhm.
to be asking, right? It's more like, what is your problem? What are
Yes.
you trying to fix? Or what is your desired outcome? And then I do have an example. Sorry to interrupt. I have an example around Chat GPT not making you more efficient. I've heard from some medical directors that are piloting summaries from Chat GPT of
Mhm.
insights that they feel like it's creating more work
Mhm.
because the summaries are long and then they've got to go check it. So exactly what you were saying with the finding it in the PDF.
The thing too I was going to add to exactly what you're saying is this kind of brings up an interesting topic of, I think a lot of folks in business unit functions like medical affairs who might not be technical experts, the best way sometimes to understand when we're learning something new is to see examples, right? Because you're like, oh, I want to see use cases of how AI can scan literature. Okay, cool. Or, oh, AI can be used to analyze field insights, or MSL Copilot, like the Gen AI use case doc I have, like people want, they love it. Like it's the favorite thing. But and I understand the want for that because it makes the AI tangible, because it gives you ideas. But the problem also, it's like a double-edged sword of, exactly to your point, Patrina, where I feel like folks are like, oh, let's just apply AI to literature review. But it's like, wait, but what are your business problems and challenges? Lay out that process first and then prioritize within that, and then make a determination, is AI actually the right solution? If it is, great. Then honestly, budget shouldn't be a problem, because you're solving a core problem for your business. So I mean, you should be allocating budget to solve something that's core. But it's interesting because you want examples to understand it, but I think it can lead people potentially down the wrong path.
We talked about freeing up time to do what's important, and in our work leading up to this webinar, and an example of physicians using generative AI to actually transcribe a discussion between a physician and a patient, thereby freeing up time for the physician to actually spend on the patient, right? Not typing stuff into a keyboard to capture factual information. And by extension, the example you raised about annotation of MLR materials for review is a prime example of, it has the potential to save time, but if done incorrectly,
Mhm.
if it's annotating the wrong portion of the PI, or annotating the wrong reference, in doing so, it's going to burn time. So, if it's set up correctly and validated, wow, it could really be a time saver. But if it's done incorrectly and not thought through, it could be a time sink.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe with all of this, I will give some practical tips on, in terms of prompts, right? What can you do to create high quality prompts? And maybe a couple of just thoughts there is, one, what I've seen work really well from the prompt side of things is, whenever you are prompting, try to give it as much context around the lens of the perspective. So you could say, for example, you're a field medical, or you're an MSL liaison that works in, breast cancer, that interacts with these types of HCPs on the West Coast. Describe yourself as the MSL, right? If you're writing the prompt. So like, one, provide that contextual lens, be descriptive in the prompt, and then give examples. So, if you're like, hey, I want to analyze a sentiment of this note, here's 3 examples of, here's a note I consider for this to be negative sentiment. Here's another note I consider for this to be positive sentiment, et cetera, et cetera. And then you're giving those examples into the context of the large language model. So it's almost like,
You're like mini training.
yes, you're giving it guidance. And that's the easiest way, without actually like training or without fine-tuning a model, to be able to guide it, just through prompts only. And I have that field medical GPT guidebook that has a bunch of prompts that I've laid out. So folks want it, just DM me or ask Patrina, who also has access to it. But those have a couple of examples. That's kind of the super high level tips I would have just on the prompt.
I would really emphasize what Vera said around needing to assign the AI a role. This is one thing that I've seen a lot of people doing when they're trying to converse with it. They'll just write something like help me write follow-up emails. And then the follow-up emails are pretty bad because you didn't give it a role, you didn't give it any
Right.
context, right? Like I'm MSL, West Coast, breast cancer, all of those things help. And the more specific you are in the prompt, the better the
Mhm.
results are.
And one thing too, and this is a little bit tangential, but I feel like another kind of misconception or where I see excitement about different models is I don't know if you guys have heard of the context length. They're, I don't know, like
Oh,
Claude.
like
One of them has like
the memory of the AI?
kind of, it's like the length of the input you can have in the prompt. So
Oh,
some are
yeah,
like,
yeah.
oh, we
Okay.
can take in like 1 million tokens or like 120,000 tokens. Like you might see it in AI news or whatever. And people get excited because they're like, oh my gosh, I can fit like a whole book in there. Well, here's the problem, or the double-edged sword of that, I will say. And this, Patrina, kind of ties into the point that you're making of prompts should be specific. And like the more specific you are, the more tuned and quote accurate or better accuracy the results are that you get back. It's the same thing with the context window or the length of not that the prompt being long is necessarily bad, but if we're talking like 1 million tokens and I'm feeding in Charles Dickens and the entire novel into my prompt, it's very diluted. So the accuracy of the results from a large context window can decrease.
It's like the boil in the ocean thing
Mhm.
that Rich likes to talk about.
Interesting.
Yeah, I
So
didn't that's super interesting.
so even providing like with the PDF example, if you were able to even take, the PDF was 100 pages and you took just 2 of them and only provided the 2 pages, that's actually much better than if you took the 100 and provided the 100 in, because you're giving the LLM like a target bounded area, like guardrails almost by which to play in. So I think that's one thing. I don't know if folks know about context windows, but I know there's a lot of excitement about them being large, which I don't think it's always the best case depending what you're trying to do.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And then the last thing I'll kind of say is I think a lot of these scenarios and honestly the high ROI value use cases do require orchestrating many tools. And the sense that I get, which is why we have like the ChatGPT guide, is that because I think folks think ChatGPT is a magic wand that will solve all their problems. I think they need to experience what it can actually do. And then what my hypothesis is people will realize it's not going to solve all of their problems. And then everyone's going to be back to the drawing board of, wait, we need to actually like fundamentally sit down and think through and bring an IT person in if we really want to address this problem. So any like kind of last additions in terms of use cases or applications? Have you guys seen teams like really nail using ChatGPT, and like what have they done?
I think I've heard of some examples, like the one I mentioned, kind of the real time use case of it.
Mm,
And I think in those cases, it really comes along with a mindset of like continuous learning and being curious about it. The people that are willing to try things and test it and not be super scared or fearful of it tend to be the most successful. Rich, what are your thoughts?
I think about 80% of companies are still iterating in this space, and a very small percentage are best in class. So I think the potential is enormous, and I'm really excited to see where things go. I've seen application of very finite areas that are really impressive, but it's not almost like omnichannel. From the last several years, it's almost like where we were with the discussions on omnichannel 5 years ago. I think we're just at the very beginning.
yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I think there's so much potential for it to make a difference when applied in the right way. And I think even from the technical side, we're still very much at the beginning. Like I know we talked about this in prep, but I think chat as an interface is like the floppy disk or like MS-DOS of the AI era. I think in a lot of ways, even the way we interface with large language models and future iterations of AI are likely going to be, very different. I think with that, where this all kind of leads into is moving forward and looking to the next 12 months and how field medical teams can really leverage AI, is that AI literacy and even understanding fundamentally what AI is, playing around with ChatGPT, understanding its limitations, bringing an IT person on board, getting your team upskilled are like table stakes. So I
Yeah,
think companies
absolutely.
should be investing in that. What do you guys think
Ag-
alongside
Agree.
that?
Agree completely on the need for education on what it is and what it isn't. And I think you did a lot today to help improve the baseline understanding for medical affairs teams. And the only thing I'll add in addition to your floppy drive comment is I've got some iOmega zip disks and some optical drive disks over here on my
Oh boy.
major work to show you how long I've been around. So
Oh boy, that's wild. I mean, it's cool. It's cool. I think how quickly technology evolves. And actually, with the AI literacy piece, just because I remember this question came up maybe like a month or two back around this, which is AI is evolving so quickly. So should I even upskill like the team now if everything's going to change? And then it's like, are you going to have to upskill over and over and over again? Or it's the same thing with evaluating vendors. Like if the technology is going to shift, like is there a point almost in evaluating vendors? And typically what I say to that is you should absolutely upskill on the foundations, because here's the thing that's not going to shift. Like here's the thing that's going to stay consistent year over year. Like AI fundamentally as a technology has always been based on generally the same principles. LLMs or generative AI or large language models are based on the same principles. So as AI evolves, sure, variations of it or the flavors might shift, but the foundational way to think about AI, to think about data quality, when is it applicable, when it isn't, is not. So I think it is worth upskilling and investing into that. And same thing in evaluating vendors. I think vendors who are technically sound should be building their businesses in such a way that they know AI models will improve. Like that you can guarantee AI is going to improve. Like that would be silly for you to base a business that it's not. But I think where it comes down to from like a medical affairs perspective is you need to be AI literate to evaluate vendors.
yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So the AI literacy piece like truly is key, or bring someone technical to help you with that evaluation if you're not, especially if you're, investing 100,000 plus, right, into some of these proof of concepts or pilots.
Yeah, and I totally agree with it's only going to get better, right? It's not going to go away. So if you don't embrace it now, and how you embrace it is up to you, right? Like you don't need to be programming models or anything. But I think having a great mindset about it and excitement around it is going to take you a long way. And then even as it changes, you'll be ready for those changes and be more ready to adapt to them.
Yeah, absolutely. You can lead your career. Like this is actually the perfect out of all of the selfishly, like out of all the arbitrage opportunities you could have for a career to like, take to empower yourself with, like the AI era would be one. Like this is
Mm,
gonna
I love
birth
that.
like in Silicon Valley, this is gonna birth like unicorn companies 5 to 10 years from now because of this shift. It would have not, you can still make, successful companies without the AI shift, but it's like it's only going to be now that this AI industrial revolution is happening. And I think it's same for your career. Like it's only now. And the earlier you start, the more knowledge is going to compound. If you start 5 years from now, it's going to be a lot to catch up on.
So true. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you can be like an old timer, right? You'll be like, remember, 2 years ago, back when we were just talking to the AI model? Now look
Yeah,
what we're doing, right? Then we could have those, like, we can be nostalgic and reminisce about it.
exactly. Exactly. Well, awesome. Well, thank you both. I really appreciated all of your different insights. This was a super fun conversation, and maybe we should like put a reunion on the calendar a year from now and see if
Oh,
how
yeah.
we shifted as an industry.
That would be fun. I love
That
that
would be
idea.
fun.
Yeah.
Thank you, Vera, so much for the time. Really enjoyed the conversation today.
Yeah. Thank you, Vera.